Adwari. For instance, when one pours a glass of water over the brim, they would say you've poured your water Adwari. And well, fortunately or unfortunately, we are right now in Adwari sub-county, a place geographically and historically associated with backwardness and rurality. But then how can we reimagine the villages and countrysides like Okere as places and agents for the performance and construction of a more just and durable futures? How can we make sure that these futures are desirable futures? And how can we make sure that these futures are hinged on growth-based, are not hinged on growth-based urbanization and capitalistic modernization as we know it? Of course, we know that growth-based and capitalist modernization has rendered rural areas to stand still, to remain backward, and indeed continue being places of the past. If there is any capitalist interests about the rural, it shall most of the time be in the interest of the capital. For instance, big corporations will come and establish large farms in rural areas. And in most cases, this will not be to the advantage of the rural people, but mostly to the advantage of these capitalists. And to the growth-based modernists, rural localities are just factors of production, as already mentioned. And after all, to them, rural and social transformations can emanate only from practices and from what happens in the cities, something which we must radically really change. But rural futurism defies such descriptions of marginality, of peripherality, and backwardness often associated with the rural. It also goes beyond villages and countrysides as mere factors of production. Instead, rural futurism seeks to make sure that the rural area is an active participant in the production and experimentation of pro-people and very almost desirable futures. It argues for the empowerment of the rural to become a better performer in the rural-urban world. How does the rural become a better performer, and how can Okere City play a role as a rural futuristic endeavor? We've been trying to do this in several ways. And one of the ways that we try to make sure that Okere City shall have a place in the future is through environmental conservation and protection. The countryside undoubtedly is where the most decisive battle to protect and conserve the environment shall be fought. For it is in the villages where there are still large swaths of land, and we have the opportunity to plant trillions of trees in rural areas. And experts already tell us that the best way to fight climate change is actually to plant more and more trees. But let's not forget that actually rural people live in solidarity with and closeness with nature, thereby emerging as their natural and best custodians. But urbanization has also taken a dangerous toll on environmental protection. In Okere, for instance, the demand for charcoal in urban areas, mostly Lira, but also Kampala, has made sure that up to 70% of the shea trees cover in the village has been destroyed over the past 20 years. To avert this future apocalypse, we have to embark on a mission to plant 1,000 shea trees every year. And for the next years, we hope that we shall have planted up to 10 million shea trees, also supporting rural farmers to establish shea parklands. And we've also been conducting awareness to promote the protection and conservation of shea trees, because we really believe that the shea trees and shea butter can be an important vibranium or an economic resource that can enable the village to have the financial means to establish the futuristic rural future that we imagine. Secondly, rural futurism also renews interest in the countryside and reduces rural-urban migration. Rural futurism rejects the notion that rural benefits must only be enjoyed by the wealthy who can afford to build palatial country homes, or those who can pay for the exotic countryside experiences. Obviously, this practice shall only make rural communities replicas of urban realities that offers very little benefits to the rural communities in actuality. In essence, rural futurism advocates for the creation of social and economic opportunities in the rural and give rural dwellers the alternatives for creating a better and dignified lives within their locales. Should people desire to migrate to urban areas, it shouldn't be because they lack other alternatives for bettering themselves. Instead, rural futurism goes so far as to imagine urbanites investing their resources and creating other social and economic opportunities in the rural to make life in the rural more fulfilling and more impactful. The impact of rural-urban migration could play a long and a significant role in averting the global migration crisis as we know it. For instance, just last year, in 2021, 3,000 young African men, mostly men, but also some women, died trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea to go to Europe to look for greener pastures. But a future where rural Africa is reimagined as hotspots of innovations and bedrocks of socio-economic opportunities could be a game changer in tackling the root causes of flight, where the African man, or sometimes the African woman, drowns at sea and becomes victims of racist and anti-migration policies abroad, and that is when they manage to survive dying in the sea. It is also very important, and it's my last point to observe, that rural futurism could potentially be the antidote to bad governance and bad politics in Africa. How so? It is important that rural futurism offers a solution to bad politics, because rural people are most often than not the most affected when it comes to poor governance of societies. And indeed, the rural is most often the site of oppression. Arguably, poor service delivery by state authorities will impact rural dwellers more than their urban counterparts, as fewer options usually exist in the rural. Corruption also makes the rural people's livelihoods extremely difficult, because rural people usually have very few alternatives and options to fall back to. But also, rural people often do not have the voice and the urgency to speak up and demand for accountability from those in public offices. Worse still, rural people most of the time are illiterate voters. And we know that illiterate voters are gullible to being exploited by politicians. They will come and offer soap and salt to rural people, and thereby rural people will just vote for them. But rural futurism offers an opportunity to make sure that rural people are empowered, to make sure that rural people are skilled, to make sure that rural people have better possibilities of choosing the right leaders that they need to transform their communities. And if this happens, maybe some of the bad practices and the malgovernance that riddle most African societies could be eradicated. Thank you very much. I hope this gives us an insight into what rural futurism is and why we should consider working within this intellectual discourse to make sure that we make rural areas places for serious investments and innovations in the future. Thank you very much. And without further ado, I am going to invite Spania, who shall be speaking to us from the Netherlands. She is an authority in the field. She has not only done research, but she also